demo, I want to go ahead and talk about the environment that we're going to use for this JavaScript course. I want to discuss some of the tools that I'm using so that if you want to match my environment, you have the same tools available to you to use and follow along in this class. Okay, so a little bit about the setup and kind of how these screencasts will work. On the right-hand pane is going to be kind of my work surface where I have the code that I want to create and demo, whether it be HTML or JavaScript or CSS. This is going to be kind of my work window, and then the results are going to get rendered over here on the left pane within Chrome. So I'm using Chrome as my browser to render the results. We're also going to be using a lot of the Chrome developer tools, so we'll get to that here in a second, and we'll see that on the right-hand side in a second. As far as this text editor, I'm using Atom. Atom's a nice text editor. It's pretty easy to use, but you're welcome to use whichever text editor you feel comfortable with. So I know a lot of people are using Visual Studio Code or Notepad++ or JEdit. I would stick with Atom or Visual Studio Code. I think those are the most complete editors that are going to give you the functionality that you need for your JavaScript work. Okay, so for this class, the way we're going to start out a lot of time is with an empty HTML shell. So the first thing I'm going to do is down here in the bottom right, you can see that this file right now is a plain text file, and that's because this file hasn't been saved. So it's an untitled file. It doesn't know which type of file it is, so Atom has no idea. What I want to do is I want to start with an HTML page, so I'm going to change that from plain text to HTML. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me some nice shortcuts that I'm going to use throughout the semester, and as you use the editors more and more, you'll get comfortable with some of these shortcuts. But the gist of this is I want an HTML shell that's going to have a head section and a body section, and the way I'm going to get that is I'm just going to type in HTML, and you'll notice it brings up this little context menu, and what that means is that that's a shortcut, and that shortcut I can tab complete. So I'm going to hit the tab key, and you're going to see that it fills in that HTML template that I'm looking for. So I have an HTML shell, I have a head section and a body section, and it's relatively empty. So the title of this video is really talking about the project structure or your work structure or your work environment for this class. So I'm just calling the title project structure. And what I want to do is I want to basically just show you the different files that we might use for labs, for projects, things like that. So this is the gist of my HTML. I really don't have a ton of HTML. We'll add to it as the semester goes, and we're going to be wanting to modify our HTML and stuff like that. But this is kind of the gist of the HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I'm just going to save this file. I'm saving it on my desktop in a new folder called Project Structure Demo. And then the file name itself, the file I'm going to choose is index.html. And the reason I'm choosing index.html is because a lot of web servers are going to look for that file name as the default file to render. So for instance, if I would deploy this to an Apache server and say this is my website, by default Apache would know index.html is the file to render. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Okay, and then you'll notice that Atom gives me this little window on the left-hand side. What that does is it allows me to work inside of Atom without having to go out to the file system. Okay, so I have my HTML file, and what I want to do is I want to run some JavaScript code. Okay, so the JavaScript code, we've seen JavaScript code before. I could come down to my HTML. I could start with a script tag. So you'll notice I typed in script, and I get this little IntelliSense or context menu. I can tab complete that. It would allow me to enter some JavaScript here. So alert, hello, world. So I have this JavaScript window, and I want to bring up that file. So I'm going to bring it over into Google, and you'll notice I get my alert, hello world. Things are running well. However, the goal of this course is to eventually move this JavaScript code out of this HTML document. Okay, so to start with, we're not going to get completely there, but we want to minimize the amount of JavaScript code that's actually in our HTML. Okay, so a starting point that we have for this course is I'm going to have the script block at the bottom of my HTML page, and it's always going to be at the bottom of my HTML page because I want to ensure that all of my HTML content has loaded into my browser before I start executing JavaScript code. And that's not always the case, but for this class, it's going to be the case most of the time. I want to guarantee that all the HTML tags that I set up in my HTML document are rendered on the page before I start executing JavaScript code. Okay? So, to minimize the amount of JavaScript code that we have in this initial HTML file, there's ways we could completely remove it, but for this first video, we're going to ignore that, and we're just going to have one method, which is an init method. Okay, so I'm calling a JavaScript function called init, and that's going to reside in a JavaScript file. So we haven't created it yet, it doesn't exist yet, this is not a keyword or anything like that. We're going to create that init method, which is going to allow us to execute our JavaScript code. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. I need a place for my JavaScript code to reside, so this init method has to live somewhere. Where it's going to live is in its own JavaScript file. So I'm going to have a script source tag. So I'm bringing up that IntelliSense, I'm arrowing down, and I'm going to tab complete that. And what it'll do is it'll say, oh, if you're going to have a script source, if your JavaScript's going to live in an external file, you have to tell me where that file is located. Okay, so I'm just going to call this structure.js. Okay, so I'm going to have a JavaScript file called structure.js. It's going to reside in my current directory. It's a sibling to this HTML file. So I'm going to go ahead and save my HTML file, and I'm going to create my new file, structure.js. Okay, so here's my structure.js file. And one thing I want to show you right now is if I run this, nothing happens, but I do have a problem. Okay, so I have a problem, and the problem is I'm trying to call this init method in my HTML file, and it doesn't exist. Okay, the idea is that I'd eventually put it into the structure.js file, and that's where we could execute our JavaScript code. But right now, as it currently stands, it doesn't exist. My browser's not really telling me anything, and this is where I have to get into the developer tools. So there's a couple of ways to get there. So I can come to my menu, I can go to more tools, I can go to developer tools. Most of the time though, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to right click and go into inspect, and that's going to bring up the developer tools. The developer tools that I care about, the window that I care about within the developer tools right now is the developer console. So I'm going to go into the console. Okay, and it's going to tell me I have an uncaught error, init is not defined in my HTML file on line 13. So that's this method right here it's complaining about. We knew that that was going to happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and define our init method. So our init method, we're going to have a function that's named init, and inside the init method we're just going to do a console.log Cubs stink. Okay, this is my version of hello world, right? So we're Brewer fans here in Wisconsin, so Cubs stink is my version of hello world, and the idea here is that my HTML page is going to render in the browser. We're going to encounter this JavaScript function init. The init method's going to run, and it's going to log my message to the console. So if we go ahead and refresh this, you'll notice my error is gone, and then you'll also see my message on line 3 from my JavaScript file. So we get our Cubs stink error message. Okay, so we're going to have HTML files, we're going to have JavaScript files, we might also have some CSS. So if I Up in the head, I will have style tag, and I don't actually want a style tag. I want a link tag, and the link tag is going to tell me I have a style sheet, and then it's going to have this href, which tells me the location of the style. So typically, I will just choose style.css as the name of the file, and then I can go ahead and add my style.css file. Okay, so let's say I mess up and I decide to call this styles.css. Okay, so my HTML file says that I'm referencing a file called style.css, but in my project I happen to call it styles, plural, .css. Where that's going to show up, you'll notice that I now have an error again. And where that's going to show up is if I look at my network traffic, you'll see that it shows the files, and I got to expand this a little bit. And really, you'll notice the user interface. I don't have any user interface, so not that big a deal to expand this. But you'll see in red that style.css doesn't exist. And if I look, it'll tell me, hey, you're looking in the wrong spot. So if I expand this window out a little bit, it'll give me a little bit better error message than what I'm seeing right now. I'm not seeing much just because of the structure of my project and how I have this organized. Okay, so I'm going to rename this to style.css. And my style.css should have renamed. I don't know why it didn't. There we go. So style.css, I can start applying some styling rules. So for instance, if I have my HTML, right now I have a body. That's the only thing I have. I don't really have anything in the body, so there is no real HTML other than the body. So I can go through and select the body, and I can say that the background color is red. Okay, and you'll notice that I get the red background color on my body. Okay, so for this semester, and as we're getting started out, a couple of things to note. You can use whatever development tools you really want to make these things happen. For the demos that I'm doing, I'm using Atom as my text editor. I have very few plugins. I have a few plugins. One of them is, if I look, I can right-click on this and I can view this in a browser or open the file in a browser, so I wouldn't have to drag and drop it from my file system. So I have that loaded. I have some print stuff loaded, but very few plugins loaded into Atom. This is kind of out of the box. The one thing you have to remember is until I save my file or until I name my file with a file extension, Atom doesn't know what that file is. It thinks of it as a plain text file. So you'll notice that once I've named these files, so style.css, structure.js, then Atom knows what type of file, and I'll get some IntelliSense and some syntax highlighting and things like that. I can get that even on a new file, but I have to come down to the bottom and explicitly change it or tell Atom what type of file I'm working with. Okay, so tools, we're using Chrome Developer Tools. You can use Firefox and Firefox's developer tools. Those are the two that I'd recommend. As far as text editor, the recommendations I have are Atom or Visual Studio Code, but you're welcome to use whatever you like. And then as far as our work goes and where this class is going to be focused on, we're going to be focusing on our HTML files, our JavaScript files, and our style sheets. And the structure is really going to come through in our HTML files. We're going to be linking to an external JavaScript file. We're going to be linking to external style sheets. Our HTML will start to take shape, but this is kind of the basics of our project structure for this JavaScript course.